All right, now that we've solved our basic problems of getting the object to be at the ground level and to squash against the ground level, the next thing we can do is we can go ahead and create a custom control that actually controls the squash and stretch. Now, there's a lot of different ways to approach squash and stretch. We're going to keep it very basic for this particular project, and we're going to continue to use the scale. Now, what we can do is we can add a custom attribute to our ball here. And we can do that by coming into the channel box here. And in the channel box, you can actually come to Edit and Add Attribute. This will open up our attribute menu. At the top, we have the name of the attribute. So this is going to be what we want to call it. So we're going to go ahead and name this Squash and Stretch. And that's going to be how it shows up in the channel box. Underneath that, we can select what we want this to do. So in this case, we want it to be keyable. You could also have it displayable, meaning that it can be seen, but it can't be edited. This is like a locked control. And hidden means it's not visible at all. So those are the different factors. Down here, we have different data types. Now, these are going to be explored increasingly in depth as we get into complex rigging of things like characters. But taking a look at these, there's a few that we're going to care about. Float is going to be one of the most important. Float refers to a number with a decimal point. So something like 1.1, 2.3, 4.6, those are all considered float numbers. Same with 0.01, right? So basically, this gives us a full range of decimals, and that's what these are by default. So those are floats by default, and a majority of the time we end up working with floats. Other things are things like booleans. Booleans are on-off switches. And in terms of attributes, the visibility is an example of a Boolean. Either it's visible or it's not. Integers are just solid numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, anything that doesn't have a decimal point. A string refers to a word, and it's often used with code. Enumerators are going to be a list, so that will give you multiple strings to pick from. And a vector is actually a multi-channel input. So something like color, for example, X, Y, Z, red, green, blue, that would be vector. The most commonly used, though, are going to be the float and Boolean by far. In this case, we're going to want to use the float for what we're trying to achieve. Next is going to be the range here. Minimum, maximum, and default. So what's the highest number? What's the lowest number? In our particular case, we're going to have a stretch and we're going to have a squash. So what might make sense for us is to maybe give it a minimum of -10 and give it a maximum of +10. So what that will mean is at -10 will be squashed, at 0 will be solid, and at +10 will be stretched. That way we can create a dial there. Now, once we have that set, we can click Add, and this will add this to our controller. There it is. You'll see just like that, we have squash and stretch as an option. But we have a bit of an issue because it only works in our mind. The way you edit these is not through the move, rotate, or scale. You click on the name and you hold down the middle mouse button and you slide left to right. And you'll see that will increase and decrease the value. You can also type in if you want to type it in, but you'll see it currently does nothing. So we need to make this do something to something. So what does that mean? Well, if I make it do it to this layer, it might not make much sense because what's the point of having a controller control a controller, right? So what might be better is maybe if we make it affect the ball, but then we have that situation where we're now affecting the geometry, and we don't really want to do that. And also, if it affects the ball, then I couldn't reuse this rig for something like a cube or a cylinder. So it might be nice if we had a different setup. So what we could do is we can actually create a group inside of a group to control this. So what I'm going to do is come to my ball here, and I'm just going to group the ball again. I'm going to hit Control G, and you'll see that this will put a group inside of a group, and we'll have this little step ladder going here. Now, this is the idea of creating what I like to call grandchildren. So up here, you have the master parent, or what we might call the grandparent. Next to that, we have the child, but this is also a parent at the end of the day. And then at the very bottom, you have the child of that child. So you get what you could consider like a grandparent setup. So in short, if we grab the top rig it affects everything. If I grab the group, it only affects the group because notice the pivot of this one is still here. So it's still scale from here. So I want to use this one here as my scale. Okay, so we can go ahead and name this our squash and stretch scale. And that's going to be what we control. Now we need a way to control it. So we're going to utilize something called SDKs, which is short for set driven key. And this is actually an animation tool. So it's appropriate we're talking about this when we're talking about animation. We need to find where the set driven key menu lives. You're going to need to make sure you're on the animation shelf, which you might already be in, since that's what we talked about last. And under the key menu, you're going to see this section here called set driven key. And what we can do is we can come in here and we can select this option here called set. And this will go ahead and open up our set driven key menu. Now, the way this works is you have a driver. That's going to be what has the controlling attribute. So in our case, it's going to be the ball rig. And we're going to want to select our attribute that is the custom one we just made for squash and stretch. And then you have a driven, which is going to be the squash and stretch scale here. We're going to place that into here. In order to get these in here, we need to select them and then press the appropriate button, either load driver or driven. I'm going to select the ball rig, and I'm going to select this as the driver since it's who's in control. I can then select the squash and stretch scale, and I can select driven since that's going to be the value we're driving. All right, so you'll see what you have loaded in the front here, and this is why naming can be extremely important, especially when rigging. Now you want to select the attribute that's going to control the other attribute. We're going to select squash and stretch in the first box. And in the second box, we're going to select what squash and stretch is controlling. And in this case, it's going to control scale X, Y, and Z. You can add to selection by holding Shift and clicking. So from here, we need to talk about how this works. We looked at animation, and if you remember, the way animation works is we set a key at a point in time, and then as we move time, if we move our object and set another key, it tracks the change. So we're using the timeline to track change. When it comes to set driven key, rather than using the timeline to track change, we're using the attribute of the driver to track change. So you can think of it as the same thing as moving along the timeline. So what that means is with squash and stretch, when squash and stretch is set to 0, we want this thing's scale to be set to 1. We're going to make sure squash and stretch is 0 by selecting the ball rig. Make sure it stays highlighted. Coming over here to squash and stretch, confirming it's at 0, and then we can set key. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it so when squash and stretch is at 0, scale X, Y, and Z is going to be at 1. So let's click key. If I click on the squash and stretch scale group now, we can confirm this because we have blue on the channel box. Blue means there is a set driven key at this location, or an SDK. Now let's go ahead and change our value so we can set it to have a squash. I'm going to come back to my ball rig here, and I'm going to set this to -10. Now, remember the way I'm doing this is I'm just middle mouse dragging to reduce this. From here, I can then select my squash group here. Make sure you're selecting the group, not the object, because that's what we're driving. And we can change these values to have the amount of squash we want to have. Now, let's go ahead and take this to an extreme. Maybe we could go to 0.25 on Y, so it's really squashed, and 1.75 on our scales. That way we get a really dramatic squash if we wanted to have it set to the ground. From there, make sure that you still have everything selected and click key. And what that will do is it will make it so at -10, this is going to squash down. Now, we can test this. If we go ahead and slide back towards 0, you should see the animation start to work. So if I move that towards 0, you can see now we've made it so this actually has a function. We've given a function to our button. Let's go ahead and go to positive 10 now. And at positive 10, we can go ahead and make this stretch. So I've moved that to positive 10. I can click back down here on my stretch scale, and I can go ahead and enter the inverse here, which is 1.75 on Y, and 0.25 on X, and 0.25 on Z. And once we're satisfied with that, we can click key to set a keyframe on this, and that will give us our stretch. And now, if we come back to the ball rig here, I can use the squash and stretch scale to squash and stretch this up and down. So now we've solved a complex issue for our rig. Okay, so let's talk about some scenarios. I'm going to save this real quick. Make sure you save yours if you get this that far. If you ever accidentally click this button, I do this all the time. Just click the Go to Maya button here, and it will return you to Maya. Don't freak out. Oops. All right, I wish they'd get rid of that home button. But we can click Save. Okay, so let's go over some scenarios, some things you might run into. What if you keyframed the wrong keyframe? So what if we made our stretch our squash? This is a keyframe, and just like a keyframe, you can overwrite it. So if I, let's say, made an issue here, for example, came in here and was like, oops, this is set to 1, and I hit key, and I'm go back into my control here, and it's not squashing anymore. What's going on? I can just come back here to -10. I can select the value here, and we can set that again. So I'm going to set this to 0.25, and then 1.75 and 1.75. And you'll see it overwrites. I mean, you probably already noticed that since I kind of overrid it to make it not work. But that will overwrite. Okay, so that will start functioning again, and we'll have our stretch and our squash. So don't worry if you get the wrong values, you can overwrite. Now, what if you keyframe the wrong thing? How can you get rid of a set-driven key? A way you can get rid of a set-driven key is if you come over here and you highlight the values, you can right-click and you can select an option here, which is going to be to delete selected. And that will delete the keyframes that are there, okay? I'm gonna Control Z though, because mine is what I want it to be. Now, what if you place it at the wrong time? Now that's a complicated one. Rather than the wrong time, I mean the wrong value. What I would suggest doing is get it right the first time. And if you do get it wrong, just delete it and start over. There are ways we can edit it on the back end, but for the most part, it is just faster to delete it and start over. And we haven't quite looked at the tools you need to do to readjust that later. So that's my suggestion for now. Just go ahead and delete that out. Okay, so those are probably the most common things you're going to run into, but that's going to be our set-driven keys with custom attributes. So just remember what we're doing is essentially using the values of one object's channels to drive another object's channels as if it's a timeline. And we could do this with a lot of really cool things. For example, we could use the translate Z of this object to move the translate Y of another object. So if you're thinking of something mechanical where one part has to move one way for another part to move the other, you can set up a rig to do that for you. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do with this. If we're talking like super complex things, you could even make like a slider on a character to make it transform. So if you had a little robot that transformed into a car or something like that, you could actually have a transform slider where you slide that and it makes the whole transformation go. So there's some really cool stuff you can do with this. And hopefully this helps you animate the ball a little bit easier and understand how powerful rigging can be, but also how simple it can be at the same time. As a challenge, what I want you to do is I want you to add a custom attribute for your squash and stretch, and then I want you to try using the set-driven keys to make it function. So that -10 is going to make it squash down, 0 is going to make it unsquashed, and 10 is going to give it a stretch. So go ahead and pause now and give that a shot.